a demo on how is it that we would implement routing. Let's look at really, really simple examples. Here we have a trivial component, a hello world component. All right, it's being added to the root, and our app only consists of a hello world component. Yes, a stateless component. And we're going to install a brand new library. Just like we install Bootstrap, we install Font Awesome. We're going to install this new library called a React Router library, which is going to introduce to us 3 new components that we're going to be using: the router, the route, and the link. Right? The router is somewhat the outer controller, right? That's going to handle all these advanced handling of you clicking on the hyperlinks, right? And then notifying the correct router where you should go. It will route you here, or it will route you over there, right? So that centralized control I said earlier, that's going to be our router, okay? Inside of that router, we're going to have multiple components that can be rendered depending on the URL, right? Depending on what the URL says. Right? This says that if the URL, this route element, says that if the URL, the path in the URL ends with /hello, this is a component you should render. And the way the URL changes is either you type /HELLO, or we'll give you a hyperlink for you to click. Right? If you click on the hyperlink, right, the URL changes, and it triggers this route to render. Make sense? Right? And you can have any number of routes, and you can have any number of links. And depending on the links and the routes, right, you can render one component or another component. You can render a course list, right? Or you can render a course grid, or you can render a course editor. Yes, depending on the URL changes for over time. Make sense? So here's an example, a trivial example of having 2 pages. So they render differently. And outside in the router, we declare 2 links, one pointing to page 1, one pointing to page 2, and they are both mapped to different routes, right? If the URL sees, if the browser sees page 1, it will render page 1. If instead it sees page 2, it will render page 2, right? So let's demonstrate. Okay, so first we're going to have to install the library, and we use npm install. What was it? React Router DOM. So React Router DOM. Let me verify that's the name of the library. Yeah, that's it. So npm.js, npmjs.com, this is the repository where all Node.js open source libraries live. Right? This is a good place for you to just peruse and see what's already there. So I've already installed it. Okay, so it's installed. And so now in our app, right, we can start playing around with it. Let's create a couple of components. We'll say JavaScript here. And we'll create page1.js. So this will be a component, right? Import React from React. And this is just going to be a trivial stateless component. Works with stateful components too, right? Doesn't matter. And here we have export. Wait a minute. Const page 1 is going to render just as an h1 page 1. And we're going to export this. Export default page 1. And I'm just going to copy this into page 2. So here's page 2. page 2. There we go. So now, if we go into the whiteboard at the top level, we could render both of them, right? We can say page 1 and page 2. Right? If we look at the rendering, we have both page 1 and page 2, right? But we don't want that, right? We want to be able to either show one or the other depending on what the URL says, right? Notice that the URL right now, let's see, the URL just says localhost 3000, right? It doesn't say anything. So what we're going to do here is that we're going to add a router. We're going to say, we're going to import here. Let me look at my cheat sheets. No, not that one. Put that here. Where's our router? I think this is it, right? There we go. So we're going to import browser router, link, and route, all three of them. So we're going to import router, route, and link from React Router. Oops. React Router we just installed. Okay. Now the new name for the router is just plain old router. Okay. It used to be that only the browser router was supported, right? Only a router that would work on a browser, right? That was the only implementation of this library. But this library has now also include being able to navigate through mobile phones, okay, for using React Native. So now there's a distinction between, well, which router do you want? Do you want the router that works only on the browser, or do you want the one that works on native on native mobile applications? Yes. So now there's a distinction. You need to there's the new name now. It's called browser router, but you can rename it locally into a local variable called router, right? Since most of the old implementations, the old applications, they all use just plain old router, because before there was only just one router, right? The browser router. Now there's two. Okay, now you have to specify, well, which one do you want? So to do that, we say here, if there's browser router, and I'm renaming it locally as router, especially if if you've been using this library for a couple of years, and all your code is based on this class being called router everywhere, right? You can rename it like this. All right. Anyway, so let's what we're going to do here is we're going to wrap our entire application. We're going to wrap it with our router. Actually, the router wants one single child, so I'm going to put the div as its single child. There we go. Let's see. Let's make sure that it doesn't blow up. Okay, it doesn't blow up. Very good. And we can create a couple links. We're going to create maybe right here. We can create a couple links. We say link. Link renders just like a hyperlink, right? It's an abstraction around the hyperlink, and the rendering is that instead of href we use to, right? So it says to page 1, right? And then you can close this and say page 1, and then another link, page 2. Okay, and that renders just as hyperlinks. There they are, right? So we can look at their implementation, inspect. They just render as just plain hyperlink. See that? Right? We could have just used a plain old hyperlink, and this would have worked just the same. Okay. But this takes other arguments, right? The other attributes which would make it more powerful than just a plain old hyperlink. All right, now that we have that, we can say, okay, well, route here, we can instead of just having these page 1 and page 2, we can use route. We can say route. Well, let's leave the 2 pages there. Let's put a horizontal there, just so I want to demonstrate. We can say here, we can use the route that if we see in the path, the following page 1, if the URL changes and we see a page 1, I want to render the following component, the page 1 component. If instead I see page 2, I want to render the second component. Meaning I will only render page 1 if I see in the URL page 1. I will only render page 2 if I see page 2. Notice these two are not being conditionally rendered. Yes? Only these two are being conditionally rendered. Make sense? Right. So if we go back here, notice that we see page 1, page 2, the old page 1, page 2, right? The ones that are not conditionally rendered. We don't see any of the other two. Yes? Right. We would only see them if I click on page 1. If I click on page 1, now I see the page 1 at the top, right? Which only renders if it sees. Notice the slash page 1 at the top of the URL, right? But if I click on page 2, right, I see the second one, the page 2. Make sense, right? So following this mechanism, we can now do the same thing with the course list and the course editor, right? We could say let's move this down below. Let's move this down below. This example, just let's move it out of the way, maybe down here. We could say that if you see the hyperlink, let's grab a couple of these. If you see editor, right, and then editor, or if you see list, I can render the course editor as a route. I can say route that if I see in the path, if I see in the path editor, then I will render the component, the following component. Right? If instead I see another route, if I see list, then I will render the course list. Make sense? So if I go back, notice that I don't see in the editor or the list anymore, right? Because it's not in my URL. But if I click on the list, right, I see the course list. And if I click on the editor, I see the course editor. And I can toggle between the two, right? Same thing with the course grid, right? If you have a course grid version, you know, with a nice little icon, right, that you can toggle between the list and the grid, you would do the same thing, right? So you could toggle between the course list and the course grid using this technique. Make sense? Right? The only thing here is that if I navigate between the course list and the editor, if I click on one course, I want to see different course, right? Not the same editor. So somehow this editor needs to be parameterized, right? I need to be able to pass you which course are you editing. Right? You need to tell me which is the ID of the course that you're editing. I need to pass a parameter. So let's see how we handle parameters between components, between pages, right? Let's take a look at that.